Hello, Tat Stewart. This is Duane Miller in Madrid, Spain, even though I have a Colombian flag back there. That's from my mother's side of the family. But Tat, it is so good to talk with you. You have recently published, and you've written a lot of stuff over the years, but you've recently published your own kind of memoirs or autobiography. And do you have a copy of the book that you can hold up and show to us?
Just happen to have one right here. Let's see if we can get a good.
Um, Amazing. No stranger. No stranger.
No stranger to Iran, its
Mhm.
people, and its church by Pastor Tat Stewart. Available on Amazon. Just put Tat, T-A-T, Stewart, and it'll pop up.
Amazing. So, Tat, you and I met many years ago. I mean, when I was doing my PhD research on converts from Islam to Christianity, and I wanted to focus on the congregations. And you were a pastor at a church in Aurora, Colorado at that time. And I learned so much from you. So, first of all, tell me, what inspired you to, after all these years, write down your own memoirs and kind of your own autobiography?
Well, that's a great question. It's great to see you again, Duane. Great to be in touch. And I have followed your ministry from a distance, and so excited about what God has been doing in your life. What inspired me was over the years, I've taught a lot of perspective courses and classes, and I've talked about my life, and it's always seemed to grab people's interest. And I was encouraged throughout the years to write. I just never thought I could write a book, but it took me quite a while, but I did that. But there was another reason too. I've enjoyed reading the journals and the writings of missionaries to Iran in the 1800s, in the early 1900s, and to learn about what was going on in Iran then. And I realized that in the last 70 or 80 years, no Western Christian worker that I know of has actually written a reflection of what's been going on in Iran. There have been those that have written sort of statistical books about how the church has grown and those kind of things. I'm not saying that, but to talk about ministry, to talk about their own involvement. And so I've been encouraged by several Iranian leaders. They said, we need more records of this period of time for the future, when people look back and say, well, what was going on in Iran before the revolution? What was going on in the first years after the revolution? So that inspired me too. And also I was inspired to write because I was a person that was told, forget about going to college. You got a learning disability, go become a plumber somewhere. And God took my life and did something that I could have never have imagined. And I want to inspire people who maybe the world says, you don't seem to have all the right gifts, or you don't have the high IQ or whatever it is, to commit their lives to Christ and fall, get into the kingdom work and see what God will do. And so my life, when I graduated from Princeton Theological Seminary and was ordained in a little Presbyterian church in New Jersey, some of my teachers came because they didn't believe it. They couldn't believe that I'd actually graduated from seminary. And so my life has been kind of like, I can't believe it, or, that's amazing kind of story. So I thought I should share this, maybe to encourage other people that are on the brink of giving up or discouraged or thinking, there's no place for me in God's kingdom. I want to say, hey, if God can use me, he can use anybody.
Amen. I love that. I remember my own theological studies. I did my MA in theology at a Catholic university in San Antonio, Texas, called St. Mary's, and they had a scholarship put aside for people who were going into ministry, which obviously was for people studying to become Roman Catholic priests. And they knew that I was Protestant from the kind of Episcopal Anglican background, and they said, "Well, you get the ministry because you want to go to the mission field." And I said, well, but I'm not Catholic, and I don't have any plans on becoming Catholic. And they said, no, that's fine. You still get the scholarship. So one of those kind of surprises of grace, and being surprised by the providence of God. That's my daughter back there. So Tat, now you were there in Iran during the revolution, back in 1979. A lot of the people who are watching this have no idea about what that was or what was happening. Give us a little bit of the kind of sociological or political background as to what was happening in the late 70s in Iran and who Ayatollah Khomeini was. One of my favorite quotes ever is from him. He said, "Islam is politics or it's not Islam." So just give us a little bit of background so we can understand a little bit about your life story and the ministry that you were carrying out at that time.
Well, actually, I arrived in Iran 4 or 5 months after the revolution. But I want to go back to 1963 when Khomeini first led uprisings in Iran. I was a high school student studying the French Revolution, and we were very excited that there was kind of rumbles of a revolution going on right around us. And as we were studying in our community school, which was an English language school started by American missionaries originally for missionary children, had grown to have several hundred students and included many different nationalities. During the 70s, I believe dynamically that Iran was making a lot of progress in terms of what we might call in Western society, development of a middle class, people had cars, people had jobs, and thousands of Americans were employed in Iran. There were, I think, nearly 55,000 Americans in Iran, and many of them lived in Tehran. And so the influence of American presence, American products, Iran's whole infrastructure, its telephone system, everything was based upon American models. In fact, they were on the verge of developing a social security system patterned after our own social security system. But during this time, the religious leaders began to recognize that they were losing ground with the young people completely. I mean, Islam was really not as bad as Islam has become today in Iran, but it was losing its glitter and its power. And so when Khomeini did that uprising in the early 60s, he was banned to Iraq. And then Saddam Hussein didn't like him being there after a while, and they banned him to France, to a suburb of Paris, where from there he began to record cassette tapes of what Islam was. And his main theme was against anger and hate for the Shah. Now, it's interesting that there were other groups too that did not like the Shah, that there were the Mujahideen, which are a Marxist kind of Islamic group that they would like to take over the country. And then there were many other factors again. So I guess the old saying that we all have the same enemy that unites us all. So many coalitions of people came together and they began to resist the Shah. Now, the Shah, I think, made one huge mistake. You know, we have, I believe, in English politics, the royal opposition to the monarch, where there's a voice for the opposition, and he was crushing any oppositional voices. People were disappearing, students who were anti-Shah, and so rather than allowing dialogue and perhaps venting of discontent, this thing grew, and it mushroomed into the putting of the Shah out of the country. Providential temporary governments were set up, and then Khomeini flies back in February of 1979 on a jumbo jet from Paris, and begins to take over. Now, all the other factions felt that they would have a say in the new government, but we arrived in July of that year, and the streets were basically there was no government in play. All the neighborhoods were controlled by vigilante groups, or what they called comités, which were sort of groups of citizens just arming themselves or protecting the neighborhoods. And so when Khomeini came, he was very, very shrewd. He let all the opposition groups exhibit themselves. So for a number of months, in front of the University of Tehran, you could buy Marxist books, you could buy Christian books. Christians were witnessing, talking about Jesus. Nobody was stopping them. It was just sort of this euphoric time. And then we were in Iran at the time when he ordered his thugs to move into the University of Tehran and destroy all of these sort of sub movements and political groups, beat them up, and declare that he was the sole leader of the revolution. And then after that came an election where there was one thing: you could vote yes for the Islamic Republic of Iran, and how you voted was put on your ID, so that from there on, whether you could get a job, whether you could do anything, you had to have that you voted yes for the Islamic Republic of Iran on your ID. So when we arrived, actually, all this had not taken place yet. And when we arrived in July of 1979, when we got off the plane, we were met by a whole band of what looked like somebody's youth group in camouflage with machine guns. And rather than saying, "Welcome to Iran," they were saying, "Death to America." And that's how we began our time in Iran.
Wow, that's amazing. Yeah, so I want to be clear for people who want to get the book or who are interested in your own life, that you were raised there. Your wife was also raised there. Maybe we can talk about that in a bit. That's quite a providential, miraculous coincidence that you ended up getting married to a young lady whose parents were also ministers there in that country. So two questions. Two people kind of popped out to me as I read the book, and you can take them in whatever order you want to and just comment on their significance and maybe their impact on you individually. One is Dr. William McElwee Miller. I got to know Dr. Miller because when I was doing my doctoral studies at Edinburgh on the topic of converts from Islam to Christianity, I found an old, small book that he wrote that I think was called like 12 or 10 Converts from Islam to Christianity. And that's how I got to know him. It's one of the earliest books that's kind of giving us an understanding of why people would make this, to be honest, rather dangerous decision of becoming Christians from a Muslim background. And the other one, he's not featured as much in your book, but I felt his story was very impacting, was Bishop Hassan Dehkani Tafti. So tell us a little bit about each of those people and their impact on you personally, and what you think we could learn from them, just spiritually and as Christian ministers and workers today.
Well, Dr. Miller was a student at Princeton Theological Seminary when Samuel Zwemer came and spoke, and maybe even did some teaching there. And Samuel Zwemer challenged him to become a missionary to the Muslim world. Now, he challenged, I'm sure, the whole student body, but there wasn't exactly a mass movement for that. This would have been in the early 1900s, and I suppose some people didn't even know much about the Middle East anyhow at that point. And so he goes to Iran as a young man with his wife. And the thing that as I've looked over his journals, and let me say that Dr. Miller became a close friend and a mentor to me as a young person. But he would go up into the mountains of the Damavand Mountains, which are north of Tehran, and fast and pray for the city below him. Now, at that point, Tehran probably was 2 to 3 million large, and today I don't know if it's 24 million or whatever. It's a huge city, and he had of all the Presbyterian missionaries, he was both a scholar. I mean, he learned Farsi to the extent that he could write commentaries in Farsi. I mean, that to me is absolutely mind-blowing. And he also was an evangelist. He had a heart to talk to people. And one of his ministries, other than the books that he wrote in Farsi, which are still treasured by many people, was that he began to disciple a number of men. And he would take them up to northern part of Tehran, and they would camp out there in tents and cook. He taught them how to tie their ties. He taught them how to eat without their hands, to eat with a fork, and how to be dignified, how to greet people. And he taught them the word of God. And some of those men became quite effective evangelists themselves in the years ahead. Dr. Miller, when I was growing up, I had several encounters with him. He'd be a guest in our home. Sometimes he'd come to Tabriz, where I was living, and he would do evangelistic meetings in the church there. And of course, he spoke Farsi. And at that point, I just spoke Azeri Turkish. But of course, we knew English, and I would go to the services where he preached, but I didn't understand too much because he was preaching in Farsi. But later on, when I was in high school, he invited me up to the Garden of Evangelism, where he would spend the summers with these young people. And he invited me to come up for a meal. And I was so excited because I loved Iranian food, and I knew he had a Persian cook, and I thought this is going to be great. When I got there, he said, today's the cook's day off, so we're going to have cucumbers and bread for lunch. And that was not a happy day for me, but I learned something about this man. He was not interested in sort of satisfying our stomachs so much. He lived in later on, when his wife went back to America and he lived there by himself, he lived in a one-room house or apartment with just a bed and a desk and so on like that. But I think the key part where he comes into my life is that when I graduated from Princeton Theological Seminary, and my wife was 8 months pregnant, and I didn't have a job yet, and I was very concerned about what would come next. After the graduation service, he took me aside and he laid his hands on me, and he commissioned me to be a missionary to Iran. Now, my wife was kind of saying, "Tat, I think we need to go. I don't feel well. I think it's time to go home," because that was not exactly where either of us wanted to go. We had been raised in Iran. We knew what it was like. We had no romantic notions about the mission field. And we thought, America is just a nice place to stay. But he did pray that. And then he would write me up until his death. He would write me and he would send me names of Iranians in Washington, D.C., where I was serving at that point as a pastor. And he said, would you follow up with this guy? Would you follow up with that guy? And of course, when Dr. Miller asks you to do something, you jump to it and you do it. Now, you mentioned Hassan Daghani, and I first met him.
But just real quick, let me mention that Dr. Miller and I, as far as I know, have no relationship.
Oh, that's a good point.
Especially for people outside the USA, Miller is a pretty common surname. So yes. This is not like some great uncle or something on my side of the family. Yeah.
I would encourage people to look up his books. He wrote a book, My Persian Pilgrimage. He wrote a book, Christian Response to Islam, which is a very fine book. And he wrote a track called His Name is Wonderful. And it's in Farsi, and it's my favorite track. And I use it all the time because he simply talks as a friend to tell people about who Jesus is. It's not preachy. It's just, this is who Jesus is. This is his life. This is what he did, and he loves you, and he wants to get to know you. And it's an amazing track.
Wonderful. If you share that link, if you share a link to that with me, I will include that in the notes.
Okay. It's available through Jude Project, judeproject.com, the judeproject.com. It's available there, and it's in Farsi, of course. I don't know if there's an English copy, but I would say anyone that has anything to do with Afghans or Iranians, that'd be a great first thing to give them. Now, Reverend Daghani, I met him the summer that we arrived in Tehran. It was stressful for us, and we realized that one of the older missionaries had a little cabin up in the hills in Damavand, and when it would get so hot in Tehran, she invited us up there for a day. It was about a couple-hour drive to go up there and sit in the cooler air and talk. And for us, it was great to reconnect with an older missionary that we had known as children. And when we got there, Bishop Daghani was also there. Apparently, he needed a break from the heat, the political heat and the heat of Tehran. Tehran can get pretty hot in the summer. And he started telling us the story of how he was being attacked by the government, the properties, and he began to just share his heart with what he was going through with all the pressure. Because you see, he was a Muslim convert who did not change his name. And not only was a convert, he was a bishop. and Bishop Hassan. I mean, it just doesn't kind of go together very well for the ears of the Muslim people. And so that's when we first met him. And then after that, I didn't see much of him. But we learned later that year that his son Bahram had been murdered. Bahram, of course, his mother was British. Bishop Dekgani had married Margaret, who was the daughter of, I think, Bishop Thompson, who had been the previous bishop, who was an Englishman. And so this was a horrible thing. And also, we learned later on that gunmen had come into his bedroom and fired 5 shots at him and his wife while was sleeping. His wife, at the firing of the first shot, bless her heart, she threw herself on top of her husband in hopes to take the shots and save her husband's life. And the miraculous thing is that her hand was hit by a bullet, but 4 or 5 bullets went into the pillow around his head, almost like a halo, and he was unarmed. And so he came to church the following Sunday with his pillowcase with all the holes in it. And he said, until God appoints a time for you to die, you're not going to die. And we all, I wasn't there, but I think it was quite an powerful service to see that. But anyhow, Dekgani, after his son's murder, was advised to leave the country. And so he left, but I attended the funeral service at St. Paul's Anglican Church in Tehran. By the way, in my book, I've misnamed it. I called it St. Peter's, and I was corrected on that. I got my P's confused there, but anyhow, it was St. Paul's for the record. And there must have been 400 or 500 people there, and many of the women, most of the women, were wearing chadors, were wearing veils, and because they were his students, Bahram students. And that's where the poem that Bishop Dekgani had written about the death of his son was read, about how he felt the grief of the Heavenly Father who must have seen his own son on the cross, and how he felt that grief. And then he called for not revenge, but for forgiveness and prayer for those who had killed his son. When those words were uttered, and I get chills just thinking about it, it was like the Holy Spirit swept through that place, and there was everybody in that place began to weep, because everyone had thought he would be calling for revenge. He would be calling for revenge, which would have been the typical thing at a Muslim funeral. And I can't help but think that many of those people, many of those women particularly, and men too, who sat there and heard that, will be in heaven because of his testimony and because of what they saw that day. They tasted and saw that the Lord was good, and I was deeply moved, and it had a great impact on my life. I didn't see Dr. Dekgani or Reverend Bishop Dekgani and his wife till years later when they were living. I don't know if they were living in England, but I think they were. I saw them at a conference in Europe, and he gave a lecture on all the ways Persian poetry testifies to the life and character and work of Jesus Christ. He said, if you had nothing else but all the verses from Persian poetry, you'd have enough to know what the gospel is and who Christ is. And I thought that was fascinating. The print, the fingerprint of God in the Persian culture back then, particularly, was in the poetry. And back then, because so few were becoming Christians, I think that the Bishop Dekgani felt this would be a bridge to the heart of particularly intellectuals and educated people, that Christ was a part of their culture, not just something introduced from the West.
Mm-hmm. Well, great. But both of those are inspiring examples of faithfulness and perseverance in what was sometimes a very difficult and sometimes literally life-threatening context. Now, you eventually had to leave Iran, and I think some people would have said, I'm guessing some people said to you, well, you got defeated, you lost, you had to come back to the States. But after you came back to the States, you continued in your ministry to Iranians, I think in Washington, D.C., and then in Colorado. Aurora, Colorado is where I met you in the offices of the Presbyterian Church there. So tell us a little bit about ministry to Iranians outside of Iran, because today the reality is that there's a huge diaspora all around the world, but especially in the States.
Well, back in 1980, summer of 80, when we were put out of Iran, and maybe you'll get into details about that because we were accused of being spies, and there's a whole dramatic story related to that. But to respond to your question, when I came out of Iran, I thought, well, I've had a year of language study. I'd learned the languages of Iran as a child. I'd gotten to the point where the downtown Presbyterian Church, St. Peter's Church in downtown Tehran, had scheduled me to preach in Farsi. So they had enough confidence that I could do that without messing up too much. And so I came out thinking, well, certainly there must be some American mission organizations that would like to hire me to do work with Iranians. Now, international students did contact me, but I was a pastor. I didn't see myself as just going on campus and working with international students. So I went out to California, and I went to one of the largest Presbyterian churches where Iranians were, at that point, most Iranians were coming to California. And I said, hey, I was a missionary, Presbyterian missionary. I'm now unemployed. Would you? And they all turned their back on me. I went to the Samuel Zwemer Institute. Every Christian organization that I thought might have an interest had an excuse. And then I realized something. The American hostage crisis was going on. And there was a disdain, and even in the Christian community, for Iran and Iranians. And so I saw how politics, in my mind, drove the church rather than kingdom values, because this was a perfect time to reach out to Iranians. They were isolated. They were antagonistic towards them. Here in Colorado, at the University of Colorado, there were several attempts at murdering Iranians. A couch was dropped from a two-story window that just barely grazed the head of an Iranian. It was a time for witness. And so I was very disillusioned at that point by my own country's church. And so I had no choice but to take up the call to pastor an American church, which came clear to me, the Presbyterian Church of the Atonement in Silver Spring, Maryland. They called me, and I became their pastor. It wasn't long that I discovered some Iranians. And the first Iranian I discovered was because Dr. Miller sent him to me. And so I remember this Iranian who came to church, to the American church, and we took him home for lunch. And then we sat in the living room, and we both came to this conclusion: we should pray that God would use us to reach Iranians in the DC area. At that point, they were saying there might have been around 8,000 to 10,000 Iranians living in the DC area. Iranians like to go to DC, and they like to go to California in those days. And so we began finding a few Iranians that God had worked in, but it was kind of hard uphill going at that point. The Iranians were not as open to the gospel as they are today. But through friendship and through care and hospitality, we began to see about a house group of about 15, 20 people. And then we moved it into the church for a Sunday afternoon Bible study. And a lot of those testimonies are in the book, how we went from sort of 0 to 60 in planting an Iranian church. Of course, knowing Farsi was a big blessing for me because it was a bridge building. I would go to Iranian businesses in different parts of the city and offer them copies of the New Testament. And I would go in and I'd say, do you believe that the Injil is a heavenly book? Oh, yes, we do. That's a wonderful heavenly book. I said, well, have you read it? Well, we don't have it in Farsi. I said, that's interesting. I have one right here for you. And I said, you are commanded to read this book by your own faith. I'd leave it with them. And they would kiss it and thank you for it. And so we spread the word. We were blessings. And so it was the first National Iranian Conference, I think, was held in Philadelphia with Dr. Miller and about 12 Iranian believers. So it was very, very at an infant stage and very hard going for those first few years.
Thank you. So we here in Madrid, where I live, we have a little Arabic speaking fellowship, and people will say to me, Duane, this is so tiny, it's so small. Like, why would you even continue with this? Why don't you just shut it down? And, you have plenty of other things to do. And I remember, and it's something that you mentioned in your book, that, before the fruitfulness, before the harvest of, all these amazing things of, thousands of Iranians coming to Christ, you have decades, really over a century of faithful Christian witness that honestly didn't appear to be doing much at all. Do you have any reflection on that?
I do, because when we sort of established the Iranian church, some of the people that contacted me were people that my father had treated 20, 30 years earlier in Iran, because my father was a medical doctor in Tabriz. And I remember one lady came and she said, "Is your father still living?" And I said, "Yes, I'd like to meet him." I said, "Why?" He said he delivered my babies, and he was so happy and so polite and so respectful when he delivered my babies that I want to come and thank him. I want to come and thank him. And so I set up a meeting, and my father brought her a Bible and a Jesus film, and she later gave her life to Christ. But the first seed of the gospel was just planted in an act of charity, an act of love. There are other cases like that. There were, and what I also noticed, right, many of the people that came to Christ with us in our ministry had a long chain of events that had taken place in their life that had prepared them. So it wasn't like this was their first exposure to the gospel. Some had dreams. Some had had dreams. Some had read the scriptures. Some had had experience with Christians. And so when I began to that verse which says, some plant and some water and some harvest, it says in scripture, I began to say, well, my job is to plant and to harvest when the harvest is there. And some of the people that were in that early group, the person who's pastoring the Iranian church in Washington, D.C. now, was one of the first converts that we had way back then. What I did, I think the way we built this church is really interesting. I had four nights a week, I went to different neighborhoods around DC in someone's home and had a Bible study and invited anybody that lived in that neighborhood, in that part of town, if they wanted to come to join us. And so every time we met, every week we met, there's always new people. We had tea and we had sweets and we had Bible study. And then we were on our knees praying for people and counseling people. And I just realized that it's God who gives the fruit, but it is we who are faithful in sharing the word and sharing ourselves with relationships. But with Middle Eastern people, with Iranian people, you must get personally involved in their lives. And that was the key. So yeah, it was not, that was a hard time. It's not today. It's I tell people today, probably every minute that we're talking, an Iranian is giving his life to Christ somewhere in the world. So it's a little different today than it was then.
Yeah, thank you. I've done some scholarship on Iran and what's been going on over there over the last decades, and other parts of the world where Muslims are coming to Christ. And I feel like today Christians kind of speak about this like, well, look at this. It just kind of suddenly happened out of nowhere. And I'm like, no, for all those things, whether in Algeria or Turkey or Persia, you almost always have at least a century of people who spent sometimes their lives over there, and they didn't have a whole lot to show for it. So, there's a time to, it's from Ecclesiastes, there's a time to scatter stones and a time to gather stones together. So when you would conquer a land, you would scatter stones because then you couldn't harvest the land, or you couldn't plant crops. But if you're going to prepare a land for a harvest, you had to just do the long, hard work of gathering stones together. It didn't seem like you had really done anything. The land looked the same as it did before, but it was necessary work before you could even plant seeds.
That's
So,
true.
so a final question for you, and again, show us the book, please. I want everyone to get the book. There's so much in this book it's encouraging, it's edifying, and it's an easy read. It's not a complex or difficult book to read. So what is your word for people today who are considering becoming cross-cultural workers, going overseas, especially to some part of the Muslim world?
Well, one thing that I think we've lost is people committing their life to a particular people group or to a particular language. And so I meet Americans say, well, I did 2 years in France, and I did 2 years in Egypt, and I did 2 years in Turkey. And I'm thinking, nothing really much happens in 2 years except you get sick a few times, and you get to enjoy the food. I'm being a little facetious, but the previous generations, my mother and father went to Iran to live in Iran, to serve there, to learn the languages, to build deep relationships. And that convinced me that I was going to commit myself, or God really called me to commit myself to the Iranian people and spend a lifetime doing that. And now that I'm 77 years old and continuing to have a voice on satellite television to Iran, continuing to have literature that I've written or been translated to Farsi that's being distributed, mentoring Iranian pastors. All of this would never have happened if I'd done 2 years here and 2 years there and 3 years there. So my advice is ask God to show you and lay upon your heart if you want to give your life to missions, to a particular people, and then go and live with them. I believe in incarnational ministry. Live with them, learn their language. Dr. Miller became an Iranian in American genes. I mean, if you met him, you would think you were meeting an Iranian guy. And so when I speak Farsi right now, most Iranians don't even believe I'm not Iranian, which is amazing to me. But it's because, of course, I grew up there. So I believe this idea of just a little bit here and a little bit there not that God doesn't use that in a certain way, but I think ask God or commit yourself to a particular people and go for it. You've committed yourself to the Arabic world, even though you're doing different things, and you will see more and more fruit in that as you go forward. And more Arab Christians and Arabic ministries will get to know who you are and appreciate you. And as you get older and your hair gets a little white, you'll get more invitations to go places. And so that's the way it works. And so that's my advice. At 19, God broke me, and it's in the book. God broke me in a very severe way. And I said, Lord, you can have my life, whatever you want to do with it. I messed up, so it's yours. And that was a turning point when I heard the call to ministry, to seminary, and then God called us back. The Iranian church called us to Iran. We weren't actually planning to go, but it was a Macedonian call when the mission field calls you. And my wife, who was born in Iran and who speaks Farsi, sings hymns and songs in Farsi, we knew that we were uniquely qualified to go back to Iran. And we did, and we obeyed. So listen to God's voice, but if there's one thing I'd say is let God lead you to a particular people and then give your life to them.
Thank you. Yeah, my wife made the comment just a couple of nights ago when we were chatting, and she said, we've been cross-cultural workers or missionaries for going on 19 years now. So we are the veterans, which feels very odd. And during that entire time, we've been working with, in some way, shape, or form, the Arabic-speaking population in the Middle East, in the States, and here in Spain. So it has brought many blessings and many challenges as well. Tat Stewart, a great missionary, a great minister. I'm really thankful for your time today. We could talk for another hour or two.
Probably.
People to buy the book. and to read the book. It is inspiring, it's edifying, it's encouraging. And also, you talked about some of the things educationally that you had to overcome in order to become a minister and to get college degrees and so on. But also there's some talk in there about some pretty severe health issues that you had to go through that are very, very dramatic, and you can really see how God rescued you in those situations. So, Tat, would you mind ending us with like a doxology or a brief blessing, either in Farsi or Azeri Turkish?
Well, I'll start in Farsi. و حالا خداوند ما عیسی مسیح و محبت خدای پدر و شراکت روح قدس با همه ما باد. That was Farsi. In Turkish, bugün dua ederim ki Allah sizden olsun ve onun öz oğlu İsa Mesih sana bereket versin ve sen onun mukaddes ruhundan yaşayasan ve bereket göresin. Amin.
Amen. Well, thank you so much, Tat, for your time. And I encourage everyone who's listening to this or watching this to grab the book, and also to ask yourself, what is your role in God's great mission to the different Muslim peoples of the world, or to Iranians in your own city. And if you're in the United States, it's almost guaranteed that you've got an Iranian population in your city at this point, because things have changed. Thank you so much, Tat.
Thank you, Duane. Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.